and welcome to Audiovisual Cultures, the podcast exploring arts and cultural production. I'm Paula Blair, and for this episode I had the great pleasure of talking with artists Susan Aldworth and Andrew Carnie, who kindly took the time while installing their work at the Hatton Gallery in Newcastle University to share insight in their joint exhibition Illuminating the Self, exhibited in both the Hatton and Vane in Commercial Union House in the centre of Newcastle upon Tyne. Their work responds to the Newcastle University-led CAN-DO project, which stands for Controlling Abnormal Network Dynamics Using Optogenetics, a process of using light to control cells which are genetically modified to be light sensitive, implanted in living tissue, specifically brain tissue, in people living with certain types of epilepsy to help control seizures. CAN-DO is a collaboration between Newcastle University, Imperial College London, University College London and the Newcastle upon Tyne Hospitals NHS Foundation Trust. Their website can be found at cando.ac.uk if you'd like more information. There is a wide range of materials and processes throughout the dual exhibitions, including different approaches to printmaking, video, light and sculptural installations and embroidery. The Vane exhibition is on until the 29th of February and the Hatton show finishes on the 9th of May 2020, so plenty of time to get along to the Hatton. If you find yourself in the tune, both are really worth seeing. Do enjoy these fascinating discussions with Susan and Andrew. Susan, thank you so much for taking a bit of time out of your install today at the Hatton. If it's okay, could we talk a bit about your exhibition Illuminating the Self and everything it involved? So that's a collaboration with Newcastle University and Andrew Carnie as well. How did you get involved in this?
I've worked with the university on two projects before. One about schizophrenia in 2012, which was shown at the Hatton Gallery, called Reassembling the Self, and another one about sleep that was shown at York St Mary's in York in 2017, called The Dark Self. And this one's called Illuminating the Self. Mm-hmm. So you might guess from what I'm talking about. I'm really interested in the relationship between our physical bodies and our brains and our sense of self and our sense of human identity. I'd been commissioned alongside Andrew Carnie in 2015 on another project looking at optogenetics, which is a way of trying to get light into the brain to sort out various problems of the brain. I'm not a scientist, so my explanation of the science you'll have to go and interview some scientists for. And during that project, I introduced Andrew to the scientists up here who were working on this project, which is called CAN-DO. And what they're trying to do here is to find a way for certain focal epilepsies of switching off the epileptic seizure before it happens via two forms. One is a brain implant, a microchip, and one is by introducing some sort of gene therapy whereby the light-sensitive cells are introduced into the brain, and the combination of the implant and these light-sensitive cells, the scientists are trying to switch off certain sorts of epilepsy. It sounds quite sort of Frankenstein, to be honest. I mean, why would anyone want to have their brain interfered with? But the truth is, with epilepsy, it affects 1 in 100 people in the country, and not all epilepsies can be treated with drugs or with other sorts of brain surgery. And so when I got the commission to make the work, it's not illustrating the project, it's responding to it. It's looking at the ethics, the human implications, and working with the scientists to widen the approach, because epilepsy is not a thing, it's somebody's epilepsy. And that's, as an artist, is always my way into it. I want to find out what it feels like to live with the experience of living with epilepsy and why you might make the decision to have an implant. So I've talked to scientists, I've talked to clinicians about their patients. During the project, I've talked to a legal ethicist about who's responsible for the brain implant, the ethics of that. But what fires me up as an artist is talking to the people with epilepsy about their experience of it. So that's the way I work as an artist. So I decided I needed to find a lot of people with epilepsy to understand. And one of the things I found out very early on is that many epilepsies are not treatable by drugs and they're not treatable by surgery. And this possible cure, and it's at very early stages of science, would relieve some people, because you can have hundreds of fits a day, and it's your own body is sort of letting you down, it's changing your sense of self. And what I've discovered a lot is it seems to change your sense of certainty. Can you imagine waking up every morning not sure if you're going to get the day? And a fit is a public thing, people see you fitting, so it's stigmatised, it's complex, and that's where I began.
This idea of illuminating the self, and this is an exhibition that's across 2 sites. So we had the opening in Vane the night before recording this. Even the exploration of light in art is something that's been going on since day dot, really. So that marrying up with the science of using light to change things in the brain is really fascinating too. And there's a lot of light in the other part of the exhibition. I think that's mostly with Andrew's stuff, isn't it?
Except my cyanotypes, which are in the exhibition, are made with light. Cyanotype is a photographic process, which is you paint a light-sensitive solution onto paper and you place objects onto the paper, and they're developed by UV light. I use sunlight for mine. So light has been really central to the development of the work. And it's interesting having the opportunity to show across 2 sites. So for me, it's meant that at Vane, I could show wall-based work, which gives the audience a chance to contemplate the ideas in a different way. Alongside the installation of cyanotypes, there are 3 very large portraits of people with epilepsy who came to sit for me, and the portraits are a very personal reflection of the relationship between me and the sitter and their relationship with epilepsy. So that's what I wanted to do with those. And then the work here relates to light, because the light that the scientists use in the brain is blue. So there's a lot of blue light, and blue light and UV light are on the same spectrum. So for my installation here, I contacted the Epilepsy Society, and I found 100 people who would be happy to write their stories of living with epilepsy. And my idea was to get that embroidered onto 100 pieces of Victorian underwear by 100 embroiderers. And I pulled that off, which was amazing. Underwear, because epilepsy is stigmatised and a hidden condition, so it's like bringing it out into the open. Also, Victorian underwear is very beautiful. It responds very well to UV light. And lastly, I didn't want to have sort of a Victoria's Secret sort of sleazy bits of underwear up on the line. I didn't feel it would quite give the gravitas to my work that I wanted.
Yes.
And also I love Victoriana. I mean, that's something that I find aesthetically very pleasing. And the embroidery is sewed with UV sensitive thread, and throughout these 100 pieces of Victorian underwear hang from the ceiling by pulleys, and in between each row are some UV lights, and the whole installation is going to move in the algorithm of an epileptic brain. And then what happens with epilepsy is, normally in your brain there's a bit firing off here, a bit firing off there. So we've got a random program so that the clothes go up here and they go up there, because they're in 20 rows of 5 down this huge gallery. And then slowly the clothes will become synchronized, which is what happens before people have a seizure. Everything in your brain gets stuck, a bit like soldiers walking over a bridge. Everything gets in step in your brain, and that's when the seizure happens. So we're going to get the clothing to get into synchronicity, and then it will stop. I had wanted the clothes to fall to the floor, but I thought that was a bit literal in the end. So we'll just shut off the lights, which is another way of stopping something.
Wow.
It's a very ambitious piece. The curator we're working with, Lucy Jenkins, and the installers said they've never installed anything so complicated. I sort of put my head in my hands. I said, no, but it's a good idea and it has to be seen. And we're making it work, which is great.
Yes, it's better to have a go at something like that.
Art is about risk.
Absolutely.
And also I feel hugely responsible. I'm carrying 100 people's stories.
Yes.
And 100 artists sewing, because I've had 100 people from all over the country sewing for me, including 35 people from the Royal School of Needlework. Wow. So I feel a huge artistic responsibility to those 200 people who have given of themselves for this work of art.
Yeah, it's really collaborative.
It is very collaborative. And also, on top of that, I've had this wonderful young guy called Will Atkins, who has been my 3D designer, who has built the frame and made the pulleys. It looks like Victorian theatre to go with the clothes. And he's dedicated months of his life to it. And he's, a young, clever guy. And then also, Alan Bannon has done the algorithms for the computer and the motors, because I can come up with these very conceptual ideas, but I can't do the whole lot myself.
Yeah. I suppose it's important to have that visualisation of just a snapshot of how many people this involves.
Yeah, and I know there's a history in art always of having studios where lots of people are working for you. And maybe it's to do with the feminisation of art that I'm happy to name my collaborators. I don't need everyone to think I've done everything. I think it's important to name people who work really hard and brilliantly for you.
Oh. The cyanotypes as well, that's an incredible colour of blue. It's an incredible shade of blue that has been produced. I was really staring at them last night because I just wanted to dive into it or something.
Well, they look a bit like deep space, don't they?
Do.
Yeah. The cyanotype blue, it was very interesting. I spent a lot of time experimenting on different paper surfaces because, it's a chemical process, but it is very sensitive to paper surface and to how much sun there is. And I decided I didn't want to work in a UV box because what was lovely about working in sunshine is that you get long shadows and it changes the images, because if you can imagine, the process is putting objects on a piece of paper in UV light. So if the sun is casting long shadows in one direction, you get a very... if you work at midday, you get a very different picture than you do if you work at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And having the freedom to play with the light like that. And in July and August down in London where I was working, we had a lot of sunshine. I'd just got them finished before the bad weather came, right. So I was very dependent on that. And the blue, in the end, I experimented with heavy papers, light papers, and I found this Japanese paper called tozawashi, which is only 28 grams. It feels like rice paper. It could just float off, which is why I didn't frame them. And it produced both very sharp images, and it always hit that beautiful blue. And I made my own chemicals up for these cyanotype solution because I wanted to be in control of everything at every level. I like learning new techniques. It's very exciting.
Is it okay if I ask you a bit more about that idea of portraiture? Because the 3 really large portraits in Vane, they're not just one panel, so they're fragmented and yet clearly together in each case. So those were originally in the National Portrait Gallery, is that right? A few years ago. I suppose just getting at that idea of probing a bit more at the self and portraiture and how to convey that a person's more than just the surface.
Yeah.
Do you know, and there's all this other busyness going on and coming out of them, and it's fragmenting them, and yet they're one person still. And those ones are black and white, so what was the process for making those?
Yeah, I mean, you're quite right about the fragmentation of a person. I had the sitters came to me for about 3 days, and we had long sessions talking, and I was drawing and photographing them. And they are, in a sense, strictly portraits of them from those 3 days. And maybe the fragmentation is a bit of me saying, as an artist, I'm not trying to capture the person.
Okay.
I recognise that we are, that sort of philosophical thing. We only exist in the moment. We don't exist in the future, and the past is just a memory. So I was very keen on those portraits to be about the conversation that I'd had with them. And so they're monotypes with something called chine collé, which means that I could print some photographic elements onto, I used Indian khadi paper, which I then put through the press with the other marks, and it embeds itself in the paper. So I suppose chine collé just means Chinese collage, really. And so it's a very interesting process for me when I'm trying to pull together the fragments of a person. So I had their EEGs, which is the sort of brain scan you use to sort out epilepsy. The first picture, Max, he was writing a book on the Magna Carta when I talked to him, and he's a very, very thoughtful, spiritual person, and I think the photograph that I took of him, I felt captured something very particular and wonderful about him. Because he was working on the Magna Carta, his EEGs, though they then went into Latin script from the Magna Carta, and they're very heraldic. I used my own brain scans to create a sort of heraldic shape around him because I wanted, I suppose it's a philosophical point, it's my interpretation of him, it's not him. And so that was Max. The next one along is Fiona. She hasn't got a heavy epilepsy. She has something called absences, which are triggered by light. And she described to me how she, the sunshine can hit her face, and from maybe only 2 or 3 seconds, she just goes and then comes back. And people don't necessarily notice, but it is a form of epilepsy. It's what I suppose they in the olden days would have called a petit mal, a small seizure. And she was very, at that point in her life, unwilling to talk to people about her epilepsy, and particularly she never wanted to let her boyfriends know, because she felt... So I put her face hidden behind where her heart should be in her, because I felt that she, for the portrait, only wanted to show a very small part of herself. And the third portrait who was Elizabeth, she, at that point in her life, she was newly married and desperate to have children, but she knew that the medication she was on for her epilepsy, she couldn't take when she was pregnant because it would damage the fetus. So I put her face in her womb. In fact, she's gone on to have 2 fabulous children, and she's having a great life. But all of them described to me at that moment in time their experience of living with epilepsy and the way in which it impacted on their lives. That's where I feel as an artist. I mean, what can an artist do by exploring epilepsy? I can't cure people, I can't change the world, but you might be able to not change attitudes, you could bring things up into the open for discussion. You could make someone think about, we've all got something. So it's a way of exploring the self, and in this case it's the self with epilepsy. And that's why the portraits are fragmented, because I think we are such complicated beings. Thank the Lord.
Your previous work, The Dark Self, I was very interested to read about that because that explores sleep more, and it seems that there's a very clear relationship between what the brain does when it's very busy, when somebody's having a seizure and they maybe aren't their conscious self, and the brain when any of us sleeps, we're not our conscious self and it's very busy and stuff's going on in there. Is there a relationship there for you as well?
It's all part of the sort of total exploration of the self that I do. Sleep I found particularly fascinating because everybody does it. And I think the exhibition I did down in York related to a lot of people. I mean, you know, we always ask, did you sleep well? I mean, I'm fascinated by the fact that we're so prone when we're asleep. I mean, I got burgled when I was asleep and nothing happened except I lost things. But imagine being a bear and having to sleep up a tree, you know, and all mammals sleep, and I think it's a very interesting part of being human. I think it's a very important part of being an animal, and I think it makes us think about what the brain is. You know, nobody quite knows why we sleep. Nobody knows exactly what goes on in sleep, but what they do know is that without sleep we would die, and without good sleep it impacts on our mental health and well-being. So it was a fantastic subject, and then very hard to explore visually because sleep is a dark nothingness. And so I tried to find metaphors, and in the end I fixed on the pillowcase because it seemed to me the indent that you leave in a pillow when you wake up is what sleep is. It's a visualization of sleep. So I printed off pillows. I worked on black paper because I thought that then I could work against sleep, and I made some sculptures which were the indents of heads and pillows. Then I got people to embroider their dreams onto pillowcases and hung them as well, which is where my interest in community embroidery came from, really.
And it seems that there's a relationship then as well between the fabric and it being at one time occupied by a body, and then that occupation's gone, there's an absence of a body, and maybe there's something there about what's going on with the brain. The body's paralysed, so it's absence in a way, and no,
that's beautiful, it's true. And all the pillowcases that I used for the exhibition were ex-hotel pillowcases. So they would have had a history of their own, and I feel the same with the underwear. That's another reason I wanted to use the Victorian underwear, because it's all been worn. It has a history before we even come to it with these new stories. I was kindly virtually donated the underwear by a young woman who runs a vintage shop in Hastings called Jade McLean from Hawk and Dove. And when we came to wash the clothes, I found that some of them had one person's name in them. And they started off when she was obviously a very slim young woman, and they ended up with a really portly woman. And the idea that I have, on top of everything else I've got in the exhibition, I have a personal history of someone's underwear, I find really moving.
It is, yes. And it has a new life now.
It has a new life, a new narrative. But the old narrative is embedded in it, you know, by the shape and the size of the clothes. And probably the DNA.
That's beautiful. Oh, is it okay to ask you about the transients etchings?
Yeah.
I apologise, I don't know very much, but I was reading yesterday about this idea of the brain tissue, and I haven't seen any of the work, so if it's okay if I just ask
the transients work is something that I'm incredibly proud of. What happened was, it was while I was doing the National Portrait Gallery show, I was invited to go to Hammersmith Hospital's Parkinson's Brain Bank to watch a brain dissection.
Wow.
And being an artist does open lots of doors for you. And so when I first got there, they got the brain out that they were going to dissect. I don't know if you know the artist Helen Chadwick, who was a wonderful conceptual artist who sadly died too young. And she did this fantastic self-portrait, which was just a pair of hands holding a human brain.
Right.
And of course, you could never hold your own brain, but it said everything I was trying to do. So when I was in the lab, I said, could someone take a photograph of me holding the brain so I can honour Helen Chadwick? And whilst I was holding the brain, I couldn't believe what it felt like. It was cold, it was large, and I suddenly, it seemed to turn from object to subject in my hands, because I was holding everything that person had been in this, well, not everything, it's obviously connected to the physical body. And I got very sort of moved by it. So I was watching them do the dissection after that, and it's a very formal procedure, and they lay everything out very beautiful. It's very, very visually, artistically laid out. And this thought went through my head, and I was in the middle of the portrait project for the National Portrait Gallery, so I was thinking, wouldn't it be, the ultimate portrait would be to make a print from a human brain? And then I just thought, no one's going to let me do that. So I spoke to the professor afterwards, and I said, look, I've just had this really strange idea. Can we talk about it? And he was very open-minded, and he said, I don't think it would be exploitative to do that. I think it might be a very interesting thing philosophically, and also I think it could help people understand the relationship of the self to their brains, and maybe more people would donate their brains to science, right, which would help other people. So he said, I'll have to put it through the ethics committee at the hospital. So we made a case for it, and they said yes. So you also sometimes have to be careful what you wish for, because having wanted to do it, I then had to find out technically how I was going to do it. The deal was that I could have some brain slices just for 1 day, or was it 2 days? Anyway, it was a very short amount of time, and that he would have to be with me at all times. First of all, I went down to Smithfield Market in London and got some lamb's brains, sheep's brains, so I could experiment with those. And we got some interesting marks off them, but the difference was that the human brain had obviously been in formaldehyde, and it was fixed, if you like, because a brain is a very gelatinous, sort of slightly blancmangy thing in real life. So we did some experiments with that. And then the professor and I drove down from London to Bexhill, where I was working with Master Printer Nigel Oxley. And we knew what we were going to do. We were going to make etchings on zinc etching plates. We were going to shake a handshaken aquatint around the brain slice to make a very dark background. But we had no idea what marks we would get. We thought the formaldehyde would be fatty, and in etching you need something fatty to resist the acid. So we placed the slice on the plate, we shook the aquatint around it, we took the brain slice off, and we etched the plates, and we got these remarkable images that look like a consciousness at work. They're really beautiful. And they're some of the works I'm most proud of. And I found out later on that Leonardo da Vinci had done the same thing with the human heart, printed directly from it. So I felt very sort of, well, obviously in excellent company. And the etchings are beautiful. I've shown them in London, and I've also shown them at the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge. To me, they're very significant works, both in terms of the process of and the serendipity. I had no idea we were going to get such beautiful marks from them. And also, to me, the contact of the brain with the plate was a huge statement of what a self is. And we got terribly emotional making the works. Nigel shed a tear at some point because we were working with permission, but with someone's brain. It was, it sounds again a bit Frankenstein, but it was done with utter respect and thoughtfulness. Sadly, I was never allowed to know who it was because of patient confidentiality. And that's quite right, but I would love to have somehow said thank you to them. Well, I've said it emotionally, but it's a thing. Anyway, so that's the transient section.
Right, wonderful. Is that the hope then for Illuminating the Self as well, to try and communicate this is what people are going through?
Yeah, I mean, the stories are other people's stories because they tell their stories better than I could have as an artist. We're trying to use movement to suggest the patterns in the brain that go on. I want to create a slightly, religious is the wrong, it's a very big space at the Hatton that I'm showing in. It's cavernous, it's slightly cathedral-like in a sense, so I want to create a sense of awe and wonder, halfway between a sort of Victorian theatrical experience when the machinery moves and things. So it's going to be performative, the work won't be on all the time, it will come and go. I've also made an artist's book so that people, and it's being put on a lectern in the gallery, again, keeping this sort of sense of awe, so that people can read the full testimonies that people have written, because they are embroidered, but because they'll be moving, you might not have the time. Also, in a few weeks' time, I'm making a PDF of the book so that if people want to read it, I can send it to them, because I know the artist's book is a beautiful thing, but it's an expensive thing, and I want these testimonies to have a life.
Oh, that's lovely.
So fingers crossed it all works, eh?
Yes, I know. I'm looking forward to seeing it tomorrow night.
Yeah, no, I better get back to making it and making sure that it all works.
Yes.
But thank you for taking the time to talk to me.
Oh, thank you so much for your time. It's been really wonderful.
Great. No, it's been lovely to meet you. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Andrew, thank you so much for interrupting your install for me.
Well, it's almost done. I'm lucky. I'm
Yeah.
almost finished. I think within nanoseconds, I hope, unless there's a health and safety issue that comes up now, I'm done. It's all up and working.
Great.
There's one sensor that I need to replace because it's kind of gone awry for some reason.
Oh.
But that's it. It's all done. Video's up.
It seems quite fitting in a way if something goes awry.
It always does.
Yeah.
In any exhibition, there's always kind of changes. And some of them are happy changes. Suddenly, originally I wanted the screen further back,
Okay.
but it created a space behind, and suddenly another work that I was thinking of showing fitted better.
Right.
And so there's something behind there in a kind of more isolated, hidden space, and I really like that. So in the mistakes and the errors and the accidents and the things not working, new things come about. That's the really good thing about it all. Again, with this piece, I was a bit worried about one of the lights. It forced me to get a second controller for it, and it works better than it did before because they're both picking up different kinds of signals.
Yeah.
So there's all that kind of things happening in exhibitions,
Yeah.
new stuff arising.
Is it okay if we describe what we're seeing?
Of course,
Here?
yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So in front of us at the moment, we've got this long screen. So you've got these layers of mesh, is it?
It's a voile, yes. It's just like a normal net curtain or theatrical curtain used and projecting through it. So it's a kind of 12-metre long projector using 4 channels of video playing. It's looped at about 29 minutes. Plays very slowly, goes through these transformations. And the voile just gives it this kind of feeling of depth and kind of strangeness, puts you in a limbo kind of space, really, which I really like. Can't even remember what it's called at the minute. What is it called? Blue matter.
Blue matter, yes.
Though it's mainly black and white.
Yes.
But it has a little bit of a surprise at a certain point.
Oh, okay.
That's one of the works. And all the works are on sensors, except for this work. This work stays on continuously.
Right.
The blue balloons, inflating balloons with drawings on, they're triggered every so often,
Okay.
will come on.
And you've got similar ones to these in the Vane?
Yeah, I've got
show
two.
as well.
I've got in Vane, in the other part of the show, I've got several balloons. They're not as big as these, they're slightly different.
These are weather balloons,
They're
is
weather
that
balloons,
right?
meteorological balloons, yes. These ones are about twice or 3-4 times as big as the ones at Vane. I'm just building up to work on the even bigger ones. You can get
really?
huge ones, yeah. You can get ones that are 16 or 20 feet in diameter. But there's a lot of drawing.
Yeah.
So they're all hand drawn onto, even with some friends doing it, and my wife very kindly doing quite a lot. It's taken a lot of time. And then with the big ones, you think, oh, I'm doing really well. And then you turn it around and think, oh, I haven't done any of this bit at all. Because it's all layered in different layers. So that's quite an interesting kind of process.
And are these, it's not really brainwaves, is it? But it's
No, it's kind of
mapping.
neuron mapping and images of neurons. And there's this thing that when they inflate, they show kind of slightly different images than when they're flat. And what I quite like is they're quite almost like tense when they're blowing up, and then when the fans go off and they start deflating, there's a sudden kind of silence about them, which I really like.
Yeah. Are they lit by UV lights or?
No, these have got just LEDs in them.
Oh, okay.
Strips of blue LEDs.
They've just got those hues that are very similar.
Yes, they are.
aren't they?
No,
Yeah.
absolutely. No, this looks like, black light or UV light that I'm working with down at Vane. There's one piece, the scope piece, has that. So now they've suddenly gone off. The time is gone. And so they'll settle down and then they won't come on. All of the sensors have a kind of hibernate cycle, so they won't instantly come back on. You have to wait 3, 4, 5 minutes. I wanted people's concentration to change as they went through the exhibition. You're focusing on one piece, like the big video, and then like this, the tree piece at the end. That's come on now, and so that's hopefully slowly revolving. No, it looks like it's not. So there's a bit of work to do on that. It's meant to be moving around. I think it gets stuck every so often, and I've got to work out why it gets stuck. So this one is, again, it's just a light and a blue filter with the shadows much slower.
And you've got a really beautiful symmetry with the shape of the twigs coming out of the tree and these neural pathways.
Oh yes, no, it's this kind of relationship between the kind of dendritic form inside us and the dendritic form in trees. And these are not just the trees, these have got the roots on as well. So they're kind of balanced, and then with the light, and then they circle. So there's this inner kind of world and this outer world. And then again, the neurons on the balloons. And then there's a kind of neural pattern on the piece at the end. The pieces are all so new. Basically, I haven't got used to the titles of them.
Okay.
So I'm struggling. This one's called Abandon the Cut. Again, but you can see these traces. These are all kind of normal neural pathways. And then they all refer to the optogenetics and the work that's being done by CANDO. I mean, in this one you can see these are the optrodes that do all of the detecting and cast out the blue light. Wow. So they're there, and this one is kind of marked out as more like a kind of crisis in the body. Right. A very small kind of thing. You see these kind of diagonal, messed up neural systems in that. Yeah. So there's lots, in terms of their work coming about, lots of it's been built out of kind of taking in all of the research and the work over a period of time, and then things feeding out. If you look here now, this other work has been triggered. So this will all be slightly more clear. So suddenly there's this bright chaotic piece that happens down here that's kind of driven and
it's quite hidden away.
It's quite hidden away, quite like that. Yeah. The only way, if you're in the main kind of part of the gallery, you can tell it's on, is because you see there's a red glow there.
Right, yes, on the floor.
You kind of might think, there's something behind there. Or you're watching the tree piece from the half hexagonal window, and then it suddenly comes on. And there's one other piece that's kind of not playing ball at the minute, which is a laser piece here. There's laser lights that are up at the top and light the ceiling. Well, I've just got a new controller for that. So hopefully, this afternoon, I'm going to plug it in and it's all going to work. It's just the power unit, for some reason, is not picking up the signal from the wireless controller. By the end of today, it should all be working. So there's basically the very large video and these 4 other pieces. Yeah, and there's a kind of a 5th piece as well, actually, that's triggered. The slight soundtrack that you might have heard is in here. And that comes on every so often, and that's on a sensor. But also when that plays, there's a fan that comes on that moves the voil, and it's kind of very interesting. It shakes up the lasers when they're on, but of course that needs to be, they kind of align at certain points during the exhibition. The problem with it at the minute is that the lasers don't come on frequently enough and for long enough, so kind of an issue. And so as you walk around at different points, the triggers should set off. And they may all be in this rest point. This one stays on all of the time, but is triggered by the sound. So if you clap, or make a sound, it also plays more vigorously when the whirring sound comes from down there, because it's got this heavy on bass, and then they kind of act out their work.
Are the colours all significant?
They are to me, in a sense. I mean, the blue, obviously, is the optrode is going to fire blue light to signal to the cells to flatten the epileptic attack. So the blue is significant throughout it, blue being a primary colour. And then in this one, there was just this kind of sense of using white as a kind of normal situation, standard situation, a flat situation, and the red as a kind of crisis. I mean, it's kind of typical colour coding. And as you can see, that sensor was just on, and it went from red to green. In a minute, I'm going to cover that sensor, the light bit of it that shows it's on, with a little bit of tape. So that's now come on. Now you can see, actually, at the other end there, there's a green sensor come on. This one triggers this, hopefully. So suddenly it springs into life.
And these lasers are filling now the whole upper part of the
room?
Yes,
filled right up the whole space with the lines and whatever. It was, in my vision of it, meant to be more central, but it kind of blocked out the video, so we had to move it back. But as you see, it's not on for very long. Should be on for a lot longer, and that's what I hope to adjust and sort out this afternoon.
I'm sure it'll all be smooth by tomorrow night.
Well, I don't know. It'll be what it is. There's enough. I feel there's enough happening without things necessarily working completely. It's a bit like at Vane, a few of the small programmable fans aren't working properly, but there's 54 altogether. 4 of them aren't working.
There's
50 fans. There's a lot to look at anyhow, and there's a limit to my technical ability being away from home to sort them out. I need to work out a better switching mechanism, but we'll get there.
Great. Would you like to fill us in on how you got involved with CANDO?
In terms of how I got involved with CANDO, I mean, it's been a long process. And in involves an individual, a man called Andrew Stevenson, who I suppose is a little bit of a patron of the arts, or I mean, quite a big patron in a sense for me. I mean, he's helped with a couple of projects I've been doing, paying for me making work. He's an ex-physicist who runs a kind of a venture capital for startup companies now. He was involved in material testing, sold a big company, made money, which he now in part reinvests in science, but also helps artists to make work. He had done one project. I approached him about doing another project with him, with Susan, and he said, well, I'm really interested in optogenetics. And we went to a few talks and things, and Susan spoke up and said, well, I think the team in Newcastle, who I know very well, I think that they use optogenetics as a process and they're trying to do something. And so we started with that, and that was about 5-6 years ago now. And we came up, and Susan and I made a series of joint prints that are on show at Vane as a kind of introduction. And that was the beginning of it. So we did that. And then we thought, well, we can ask, maybe we should apply for big public engagement money. The scientists were very keen on it because they wanted to talk to the epileptic community about their work, and there seemed to be an opportunity, and the Wellcome were very keen on it. So they gave us a very reasonable grant to make work for over 3 years. So we've done about 2 years research, and for me about a year of making this work. Most time making the video, and then the sculptures that have come out of it since then. Well, it's been good. I think I've made 10 works altogether, maybe slightly more, 11 works.
Yeah, and they're all substantial.
I think they are, yes. I think,
Yeah.
yeah. I've got used to making things quite quickly. I've got better processes of making the video now and getting a little bit of help here and there. I mean, I used to do all the drawing by hand in the videos and whatever for all the trees and everything. And now I've got some people that will help me with that. And that makes it a lot easier. I mean, the last piece I made, a large video projection like this, was about a year.
Right.
And me doing drawings
My
2 or 3
goodness,
days a week. To do all the drawings for it. So I was almost, by the time of editing it, I was exhausted. But this one, basically, I got all the drawings done in 3 months, and then we started to edit and put the projection together. And it's a blend of drawings and photographs and whatever. And again, all these things come into it that I've kind of seen and experienced. One of the things I was kind of interested in was, this notion of the trees where I live around Winchester, quite a lot of them have mistletoe.
Oh, okay.
And the mistletoe seemed to me to be like a kind of point of epilepsy in the brain with this muddle of cells. So I took lots of photographs of mistletoe, and they became incorporated in it. And I quite like this idea of them pruning the mistletoe, but in an impossible act, really. And that's where the optogenetics comes in. Really, this operation and the implantation of the optrode into the brain will come when they can't surgically remove that centre or do something. It's a kind of point of last call, really. It's the last thing they can do, and that's what they hope. So I think that's kind of interesting. So it deals with different issues of putting things in, of being watched as well, with this sense of the optrode being in there and the logarithm that's produced by people that are outside the body. So you're being controlled in a way. I know we're all controlled in a way by other people, but there's a very particular thing about one's body, which one thinks one has ownership. And so the USB fan piece at Vane is very much about that.
Right.
It's got lots of quotes about being a cyborg, being this kind of multiple person with a device inside that's being controlled. And they're often wirelessly connected, and there are all sorts of considerations, legalities about that.
Yeah.
All sorts of questions now arise about where we move and who owns us. It's a very interesting question. I think all the big companies want us to own the implants that we have in us and not, in a sense, hold responsibility if they go wrong.
Sure.
And that's a really interesting thing. So they're not very clear about who owns them. They let you think that you own them, but actually for you it's quite good that they own them and that they're responsible if they go wrong. And they have to put them right. So, interesting topic.
Yeah, it brings up a lot of ethical issues.
Lots of ethical issues, and I think the pieces, Vane, or the one piece at the end, A Tale of Two, is the piece that kind of lodges those questions. It's not a simple story. There's pros and cons of all of these things.
Yes.
And I think we need to be aware. I mean, the other big project that I've been involved in for 10 years has been around heart transplant, and that's really interesting because the psychological issues of having somebody else's heart are immense and very complicated for people. People that have transplants often are holding that in mind, and it troubles them at times.
Yeah.
And we don't talk about that. And that's partly because with heart transplant, when the patients come back to the hospital, they're very thankful to being alive. They very rarely describe the complexities of the issues that they have with it. And the team and the Heart Project set out to interview the patients post-transplant in their own homes.
Right.
And then you get a different story about a much more complex relationship. In that case, because it's a heart that's come from somebody else, complex relationship with the donor and the donor's family. I mean, this is more complicated as well because the optogenetics and the Can Do project will be putting in an optrode optrode into the brain, but it also has to affect genetically the cells near where the optrode is to make it work. So they have to be basically primed to be affected by the blue light that the optrode will give out when it senses an epileptic attack coming and happening to suppress the cells. That has to be introduced. So there's genetic modification, really, of human beings. And that's put in by a viral vector, and people might be upset about that. So a virus has to be put into the body to deliver those opsins, which are the controlling cells, into the right place. So, yeah, very complex, very interesting, I think, about who we are, how we see ourselves through science. And I think it affects us all. I think it helps us kind of understand ourselves by seeing what happens in the science, and maybe a particular group or class of people, class of patients, can tell us a lot about who we are. So kind of understanding autism and the different pathways in an autistic brain tells us what normal is, or what all the gradients to being normal are. So I think this is really interesting territory. I'm just fascinated actually by the piece. It's kind of actually working. So if you see the blue lights and
they're flashing.
They flash more, come on more as the sound levels go up. Chadwick, please, it's working, because yesterday it wasn't working properly at all. Now it is. So now you see that there are two lights on.
The sensors
the sensors are on. That will send something on.
And so is this...
And that will send something on. So the lights are around the back. So I don't know if you've seen this one. Well, did you see this?
Just a little bit from the other side.
I've already forgot, yes.
So yes, there's a nice invitation, because you wouldn't automatically think that you can come around here, because it feels a bit backstage.
Well, what I'm hoping is people will kind of sit on these seats, maybe watching the tree thing, and then realise, something else has happened.
Yes, this idea of something being hidden or
does
tucked
need
away.
a little bit of tidying up down the back there. We've got to clear away the wires and things, but yes.
So are these just small fans fitted with LEDs? Is that...
They're a proprietary thing that you can just buy.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I mean, some of them I've altered because some of them are programmable and you can put words on them.
Oh, yes, okay.
So this close blue one actually has got a series of statements on it, and actually should be more visible, and that's one of the tweaking jobs I've got to do, is just twist it round so it can be seen. Okay, I've just been fixing that and setting it up. Yeah, and now this one, which is not playing on, but the sensors come back on, so that fire into action.
And so is the idea that the foil will drift around and then the lasers will move?
Maybe a matter of me resetting the fan slightly. It's been slightly problematic in terms of health and safety in the lasers. The lasers in my studio came down a lot lower. Now they have to be higher because we don't want anybody looking into them directly. So there's all these things, swings and roundabouts.
Do you have an overall aim or hope for the exhibition? Is it about communicating to the general population about this is what it might be like for people with epilepsy, or anything like that?
I think it's more general than epilepsy. It's more like, if I want anything to be discussed, it's about what the science is. It's about being cautionary in a sense about what it gives us, but it is telling us very much at the moment about who we are and how we are in the world. And I think that we need a kind of critical forum for discussing that. And I think this is a point to begin to think about that, to have the discussion. And I don't think that the exhibition is the totality of that. So I think there's kind of symposiums, the workshops, the schools, things that have been going on, all of the other kinds of things are as important. In fact, in the Heart Project, what we run with that is these kind of 3-day symposium where we get professionals in and we begin to unpick some of the issues. And some of the issues they're not even aware of. So we've had specialist heart transplant nurses saying, I've got to change my approach. I hadn't thought about this at all. So we're kind of seeding ideas about things. And it's an art show for me. I'm an artist. I'm not an illustrator. Well, I'm saying that. I love illustration and it's very good. I'm not saying that illustration is poor or bad. It's part of it, but it's more than that. It's about a conversation, and I think that's what artists do. They produce a platform where things can be discussed in a wider, more complex way. And also just to signal things. I mean, I think that part of my job is to signal to other people, other young artists, this is what you can do. These are the possibilities. You can use a commercial fan and you can make a piece of work about it. And it's permissible to do that. I started as a painter, but I still think I'm a painter. But I'm using light. And there are other ways of achieving things and doing that. So there's all sorts of levels, I think, in which art work. Complex.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much.
No, good.
Thank you so much for your time.
No problem at all. Fine.
You've been listening to Audiovisual Cultures with very special guests Susan Aldworth and Andrew Carnie. Many thanks to the Hatton Gallery for accommodating us as well. This episode was hosted, recorded, edited and produced by Paula Blair. The music is Common Ground by Airtone, licensed under Creative Commons Non-Commercial 3.0 licence and can be downloaded from ccmixter.org. Many thanks to members at patreon.com/avcultures for your much appreciated support. One-off donations to help keep us going are gratefully received as well at paypal.me/PEA Blair. Episodes are released every other Wednesday. Subscribe in your podcast app so you never miss an episode. Our full back catalogue can also be found on YouTube if you do. We're on Instagram as AV Cultures Pod or simply AV Cultures on Facebook and Twitter if you'd like more information and useful links. Thanks so much for listening and catch you next time.